Tonight we are going to talk about continue this discussion about the trajectory of ecological thought and its implications for sustainable development. And tonight, oh, just a sec. Oh, okay, this is the wrong title. It's not where have we been, where are we at, where are we going. This is the age of reason. That's what we're going to talk about. The rise of the age of reason. So I want to make sure I got the right one up here. Okay. So where we left off last time, where we were talking about rapid economic expansion in the UK was occurring. So in 1765, you had a number of technological innovations like the spinning jenny, like the power loom, like the steam engine. Productivity was a driving force. So really you saw like a lot of push for industrial development or economic development in general. One example of that is the push for landscape transformation for food production. Roughly 6.5 million acres of English landscape were transformed into rationally planned landscapes, square lots for food production. So obviously, you can see the pattern here. This is science for the sake of productivity. So this is a quote from the agricultural reformer Arthur Young: "Make 2 blades of grass grow where one grew before." That's what they wanted to see, right? So this is not like Gilbert White looking at the beauty and interrelationships of nature. This is looking at, well, how do we maximize production of these systems? Different way of doing things. So, but you still had this pushback, right? So I call it a philosophical pushback from the spirit of Gilbert White, and Arcadia was not totally extinguished. You know, this feeling of the pastoral vision of the Arcadian view of nature. In fact, it lived on quite strongly. So industrialization and science, to some degree, for many, were thought to be threats to the Arcadian dream, the romantic idea of humanity living with nature. So the question is then, who would win? Is it the romantic version of nature? Is that going to win? Or is reason going to win? That's a question. So, well, what are we talking about when we talk about reason? Well, it's really important to understand this idea and then how it has evolved and continues to evolve over time. So the rise of reason. So the 18th century was known as the Age of Reason. So this is the 1700s. There was divergence of 2 roads that was prevalent in ecology. So one was this kind of idyllic romantic view of nature. So this was coming from Selborne, White's view. But there was another form of pastoral ideal in Western civilization, and this was derived from Christianity. So this is similar to that pastoral view from Selborne, which it was kind of pagan in a way, so it wasn't tied to religion, although he was actually a preacher. There was also another form of this pastoral ideal in Western civilization that came from Christianity. They call it the Christian pastoralism, is the phrase to describe what they said the care of livestock on the part of shepherds. Like, this is where it came from. So this is kind of quite a bit different from what we talked about previously of the pagan model. And the pagan model was the Arcadian ideal, in that God was a source of guidance and the shepherd is the defender of the flock against the wilds of nature. So whereas the Arcadian ideal saw nature as a source of beauty, right? And nature as this intrinsically spiritual thing. Whereas this model had more of a kind of a divine creator and then protection of the flock against the wilds of nature. So in essence, the Christian and Judaic view have largely been, many cite them as being anti-natural. seeing nature's primary function as to serve man's needs. So throughout the 18th century, there was a push and pull between the pagan and the Christian perspectives. Christianity having to mellow out, actually. So, like, once Christianity really pushed their kind of agenda as man having dominion over nature, and then you had the pagan people push back and say, hey, just a sec, this is, there's intrinsic quality and romantic quality of nature. Let's not indicate that we are separate from it and that we control it. That's not what we believe. So there's this big of a push and pull. But something that was also emerging at this time was science. So, and it was also emerging as a source of conflict, a potential source of conflict. So, like, Christianity could see it as a bit of a threat because it was a reasoned approach for understanding nature, which, if taken the wrong way, could refute the creation, as this has been debated a lot, and could refute a belief in the divine, right? So there was a bit of threat of and therefore the need for reconciling, in some people's minds, the importance of Christianity and spirituality, and then the importance of science. But there was some people, but one particular, Nicholas Berdyaev, says that Christianity alone made possible both positive science and technique. So he argues that it was Christianity that was the most powerful force in establishing science, as in positive science, meaning like observation and understanding nature, and then techniques for doing that. So he suggested that Christian faith severed man from nature emotionally. So we didn't have this emotional connection to nature like the pagan romantic view of the Arcadian ideal. Rather, we were separate from nature. Nature was a divine creation that was there to serve man, and therefore we could observe it and understand it. That's his argument. So therefore he's saying that the Christian faith was actually largely contributed to scientific development. So this opened the door to rational objectivity, which is one of the main modern tenets of the scientific method, objective analysis. So the idea that knowledge must be created without the influence of subjective feelings. So it doesn't matter how we feel or what our emotions are about nature or about what we're observing, we are to observe and understand it. So the separation of the human mind from the intertwined inner vital spirit of nature, which was characteristic of pagan animism, was argued by Berdyaev through Christianity. So you can see there's different forces at work, and these are all things that are actually playing out today. So Christianity, it gave the gift of objectivity. In addition, one can argue that it helped formulate a mechanistic view of nature with the non-human entities void of souls or inner spirit. So what it did at this time, anyway, the great treatise on the paradox of nature with the Canadian. Great, good, thank you, good contribution. So what? And this is we're still working on this stuff. It's not over. But what I'm trying to kind of paint here is an epoch in which this really influenced ecological thinking. So what this started to do, this kind of separation of man and nature, is help to formulate a mechanistic view of nature with non-human entities not having souls or inner spirits. That's kind of what Christianity was promoting at this point in time. Humans have souls. That leaf does not have a soul, right? So a whole logical intelligent design constructed and imposed on chaos by the creator. So this kind of design of nature was imposed, intelligent design was constructed by the creator to imposed on chaos. The order was created. So this provided a perspective that nature was designed, and hence, if it's designed, we can predict in some ways how it works. So this means to determine through reasoned inquiry, right? So if there's design to this, then if we observe it properly and couple it with methods, we can have predictive capability, right? So what is that? The predictive capability is science, the scientific method. So this line of thinking was pervasive in 18th century ecological thinking and writing, and it can closely be linked to an imperial view of ecology or science, because what it did here, when I'm saying imperial view, it's our dominion over nature, and our dominion over nature such that we can use it in ways that benefit us, benefit the economy, and benefit our social development. So imperialism, the imperialist view of science was most prominently professed before the 18th century, as actually was Francis Bacon. So Bacon lived from 1561 to 1626, and the Baconian view of nature was that man had dominion over it through active science. So he was a big shot. So Francis Bacon, if you've done any reading about philosophy, or particularly philosophy of science, you'll have encountered Francis Bacon. And he was an influential philosopher at the time and served as a Lord Chancellor of England and this is quite a while before Gilbert White came along and the Arcadian view emerged. So here's a quote from Bacon saying, "The world is made for man, not man for the world." Right? So what does that tell you? That tells you that nature is for our disposal. It's for our use. We are not made for this world. Man is not made to serve the world. The world, meaning nature, is made to serve us. So one would think that there would be no means of reconciling the Arcadian ideal and that of the imperial view of ecology, because they're dramatically different, right? The Arcadian view of ecology was such that we are an intrinsic part of nature and this beauty and wonder of this holistic integrated enterprise, right? Whereas the imperial view is saying, no way, that's for us to use and exploit. So what happened? Well, the next phase of this is a systematic scientific pursuit. So what happened in the 1700s, so 18th century, was along came a fellow named Linnaeus, who lived from 1707 to 1778, whose proper name is Carl von Linné, but everybody calls him Linnaeus. I don't know why. I'm not sure. I should look that up. But he's known as Linnaeus. And he's generally considered to have made the most outstanding contribution to natural history in the 18th century. So he was like the, I don't know who to compare it to for this century. I don't know. I mean, maybe you could say David Suzuki, but this guy was like way more like ultra heavyweight contributor to scientific natural history and natural science. Known as an enterprising and ambitious in his intellectual pursuits, he was a Swedish person. He started out small, so he came from an early rural life in a cottage in southern Sweden to a place of great honor in Swedish nobility and royal councils. And it was his scientific pursuits that brought him along that journey. So his passion appeared to be in organizing and arranging of botany. That's what he really was passionate about. So he, as an example, he traveled 5,000 miles in the Arctic Circle to botanize snowy fells. So, I mean, that's dedication for you, to travel 5,000 miles to categorize and capture samples of botany. So what was remarkable about Linnaeus was that he was very systematic and scientific in his approach, yet at the same time, he concurrently held a very majestic awe for nature. So he was in awe, he reveled in it, right? So this is a kind of combination of the Arcadian view. So I was saying before, how can you reconcile these two worlds? Like a scientific imperial approach and yet this kind of emotional and subjective Arcadian view. So Linnaeus, though, kind of embodied that, because at the same time as he was very systematic and scientific in his approach, he was like in love with nature. Like he would like roll around and just kind of like be in awe with what he was witnessing, right? And he's most widely known for his system of plant classification called the Systema Naturae, in which he took a very economic approach. So what he did was he went about counting the amount of stamens and pistils in a blossom, noting their position, and then used that as the basis for his classification system. And this then was kind of one of the first largely widely accepted universal taxonomic system. So a taxonomic system is a way of classifying different biological species, right? This has 4 legs, this has 2 legs, this has 5 stamen, this has 4, this kind of stuff, like different characteristics that give nature different structure, right? So with Linnaeus, although he was, arguably still the greatest naturalist of that time, his system has been refuted and criticized hundreds of years later, in that many scholars diminish his contribution as saying it's not really that original. He was just counting stuff and then documenting it. But what his simple system did do, and perhaps why he is the most important naturalist of that century, was that he had clean-cut categories based on his classification system that was replicable and allowed us, or humans, to bring some sort of order to chaos. Right? What is all this stuff that's around us, this nature? It's all over the place. Look at all these different animals and species and so forth. What he was able to do is to create a systems framework that you can organize and classify stuff. So this was important in making, a sec, I'm going to check, make sure that everybody got the memo. Just one sec. I will continue. Sorry about that. But what he did, he's brought order to chaos, right? And it was very important. It was important in making science and natural history accessible to the public, so people started to understand this stuff better. And it was a very important precursor to the theory of evolution, right? Like without Linnaeus, I don't know if we wouldn't have the theory of evolution, right? Darwin used Linnaeus's system to try and understand what he was observing in the Galapagos Islands and so forth, and then came up with this theory of natural selection. We'll get to that as we go on. So it's a very important step to bring classification and reason to what was previously chaos in many people's views. Remarkably, despite his scientific successes, he never lost his piety and looked ultimately to nature's God as a source of inspiration. So he's a very kind of religious person. This was captured in his crowning accomplishment was the essay, The Economy of Nature, written in 1749. And what the goal of that was to find the hand of God in nature, but expressed in geobiological interactions, with God setting up the enduring community of peaceful coexistence. Right? So what does that mean? Well, that is basically the foundation of ecology, but with a biblical slant to it. Like he was trying to structure and give some form to not only the organization, but the function. How does all these geological, biological things work together? And then if in doing so, who created this kind of peaceful coexistence of how these things work together? So if you've read any James Lovelock, you would say, well, this is like the Gaia hypothesis, which is true. It's a precursor to that. So through the economy of nature, he saw man and his ambitions as in line with other species, but he gave a special place of dignity and honor to humankind. Man must vigorously pursue his assigned work of using his fellow species to pursue his own advantage. So, Linnaeus was anthropocentric. Although he had this divine view of nature, he established a system. He put humankind in the position of control for utilitarian use of nature. This was the first widely used instance of the word economy in natural science, and throughout the 18th century, scholarly activities identified God as the supreme economist. So this is where we start to see the use of economy in nature, right? So the economy of nature was essentially an organization and study of how resources were shared and used in nature to keep it functioning properly. That's what it meant, the economy of nature. So how does nature kind of share resources, right? So what is that? Well, the sharing of resources in nature is basically how ecosystems function, and that's ecology. So this led to the idea and the articulation of the word ecology. We'll get to that later on. So metaphor and method. So some challenges to this structure. So modern science had found a metaphor with the Linnaean view of nature being a grand, well-oiled machine. So Linnaeus came up with this grand vision for nature being this dynamic and interactive structure that works beautifully. So this metaphor and the classification method became dominant paradigms. So a paradigm is a worldview. So the mechanistic view of the modern world was pervasive in physics and astronomy with the contributions from people like Newton, Descartes, and others. So this is where we started to see we have a mechanism, we have this kind of thing that works in nature, and then we have rules that we understand through observation and derived through observation that dictate how this works. So, but some of the folks took this to extremes, and this is where we get into this kind of the rise of reason to an extreme. And René Descartes was one of them. So Descartes, this is a quote from Descartes, animals are no more than machines. So Descartes just viewed everything as kind of a functioning objective machine. But this actually was a problem for Linnaeans. It presented challenges to Linnaeans in that they saw it as first steps towards atheism. So despite the fact that Linnaeans had this classification system, viewed the economy of nature with this mechanistic view, like a machine, they were still saw God as a divine creator. They weren't atheists, right? Whereas René Descartes was pushing the envelope a bit with this reasoned approach. So Newton, on the other hand, was a devout Christian as well, and how he positioned God in his way of viewing nature was God was the crucial motive force behind the cosmic machine, right? So if you've studied any physics, Newton's laws and so forth, like you would look at force equals mass times acceleration, or an object in motion tends to stay in motion, and these kind of things. He saw the motive force behind all of the findings that he observed in nature through his assessment as being this from God. I mean, God was the source of this. So the age of reason was ultimately utilitarian in that man's dominion over nature was in place for sustaining well-being, regardless of who you were, though. Like, that's the thing. It doesn't matter if you were like more on the atheist side, like René Descartes, or if you were more a Linnaean, or you believed in, you were in Newton's camp. Ultimately, nature was still there for our use, for humankind's use. Therefore, we had dominion over nature. So, having gone through this kind of trajectory of the age of reason, and then what came out of it, which was a lot of science and a lot of understanding, classification systems, and so forth, what are some implications then for sustainable development today? Well, what we have to think about is the lessons learned from this age. So today, for instance, we have far more advanced science than there was in the age of reason in the 17th century, 18th century, 1700s. Particularly, like, let's just take taxonomy, for instance. We have, even in Canada, we have world-leading technology for assessing taxa of species, right? This is the Barcode of Life project over at University of Guelph. Crazy advanced science for classifying stuff. Incredibly advanced science today. Yet, one of the problems we have is there is still a large degree of uncertainty and surprise that we must deal with. So there's a lot of uncertainty. In ecosystem science, we call it stochasticity. In environmental management, we deal with it when we start to look at coupled human and social and ecological systems. So in addition to that, the uncertainty and surprise, we have the moral values of the value of ecology itself are currently brought into question from a number of different groups and cultures, right? So are we the ones that are, is nature made for us, or are we supposed to serve nature? I mean, that was the question that Bacon came out and said, no, nature's for us. That's a Baconian view. Whereas today, there's a lot of people many people that would strongly disagree with Francis Bacon, right? And I would say First Nations in particular in Canada and British Columbia. So reason alone cannot answer these questions. We can't use reason to answer these questions. So what we might have to do is to consider different epistemologies and worldviews. So epistemology is a way of knowing about something. So I could use a population ecology epistemology for understanding this ecosystem. That would mean looking at the different species and how they interact. Or I could take some other, maybe more spiritual epistemology. It depends upon what body of knowledge I want to use to understand what's going on with something. But what's clear is today, just a reasoned and scientific epistemology is not enough to help us solve these problems. And then different worldviews that are associated with that. In addition, the predominant theme of man's dominion over nature is being seriously reconsidered at this point. So it doesn't appear as though we are as in control now as we were in the time of Linnaeus, Bacon, and Descartes, right? So if Bacon were alive today, he might look at some of the things that we're experiencing with storms and nonlinearity in weather and increasing disturbance in the Earth system and think to himself, well, maybe we are not as in control as I had thought. Maybe nature has something, ideas of its own, right? So by looking to the roots of these ways of thinking, what I think we need to think about, we can try and hopefully contextualize this knowledge in the modern day to come up with solutions. And like an example of that is exactly what I just said. So let's look at development in British Columbia, say LNG facilities or pipelines or any kind of development that is going to impact or use nature. We might have to consider the fact that there are inherent uncertainties in some of these systems. We can do for sure in forestry and agriculture and so forth. We need to think about those. And we can also refer back in time to see where this thinking came from in the age of reason, where there was a heck of a lot of hubris. Like back then, we hadn't experienced certain things. So at that time, we hadn't experienced the crash of stocks, say crash of stocks of fish and so forth. There was plentiful resources at that point in time, whereas now we are under resource constraints. So we need to think about that because the way we use reasoned science needs to be couched in a broader context. And this is where the readings for EN 322 come in, with the readings from Folke and Halling and so forth. They talk about a lot of that stuff. And looking at resilience thinking and the coupling of ecosystems and social systems. So that is the age of reason. And kind of what it did is it set the stage then for modern science to kind of proliferate. And we'll get to that in the next lecture. We'll start to look at how that manifested following that. Does anybody have any questions? What do you think? Do you agree with Bacon or do you agree with Descartes? Do people think that animals have souls or rights? Or are they only there for our use? I guess they're there for our use. The building, yeah, rights. Yes. Yeah, I have a lot of dogs. I live in Vancouver, and there's a lot of people own dogs in my building. So 5 times out of 10, when I get in the elevator, there's a dog in the elevator, and so I encounter these. I like dogs, and I mean, to think that they have no soul. I don't know. I mean, I just think that's kind of crazy. When you're like petting them and stuff, and they're just loving it, eating up. They have emotions and so forth. There's a philosopher today whose name is Alva Noe, Noe. I think both points of view are interesting. With how popular anthropomorphism is now. Yes, and kill the chicken, saying I believe it. You're eating the soul of a chicken, pal. There you go. They say that you eat what you eat, you become, right? So you're going to start clucking, you know, wandering around shortly. Uh, yeah. So, I mean, we'll probably get to this later, but you get further on, we start to look at, say, E.O. Wilson. So E.O. Wilson's a much more modern scientist. He talks about biophilia, biocentric egalitarianism, so treating all life with equal rights. And that was the, a precursor to that was the deep ecology movement, which we'll talk about later on, which people thought, like people like Alan Drankson and Arne Ness and so forth, many put a value based on their perception. So, yeah. So the deep ecology movement emerged from these kind of transcendentalists, which were like, you know, I guess 50s and 60s. And they looked like really deep into nature and deep value for nature. So they put that before any kind of development. Like you didn't see anything like that in the 18th century. You had the Arcadian view, right, which saw this kind of majestic creation that we were spiritually tied to, but it was still for us to use. There wasn't a question of whether or not we should exploit those resources or not by anybody. Well, not by anybody, but by dominant ways of thinking about things. You didn't have like, let's conserve nature for the sake of nature type of thinking. That came along later. We'll see that. But it's important to see why I'm trying to do with this. It's interesting because collectivist societies don't always agree with humanistic individual approaches. UNDHR. So taking a rights-based approach to animal rights seems like an extension of Enlightenment philosophy, not a full principle. All right, there we go. Tone it down. Yes, exactly. Yeah, well, balancing uh, individual rights versus collective rights. So, what is the collective? I guess is another thing to take into consideration. Like, if you're a biocentric egalitarian, you would look at all of life as having equal rights. Right? Spectrum of okay. Uh, oh, like, are you meaning like, say, looking at an objective viewpoint, say, objective science? Oh, okay, Ayn Rand. Yeah, I'm not. I've only read Fountainhead, so I'm not a. Uh, objectively, we should eat animals. Altruistically, we should not. Sure. So, tangent, right? Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't have. I'm not a complete vegetarian. In fact, I've been eating a lot of meat lately because I'm trying to kind of. I had an injury last year, neck injury, and I'm trying to kind of get stronger. So, I mean, I'm not a vegan, but I get it, and I do think that. So forget about objective versus altruistically, just purely based on sustainability standpoint, we should minimize the amount of land mass that we are taking up and resources we're taking up to get our nourishment, right? So having a fully meat diet is not a way to do that. Period. End of story. Objectively or altruistically, don't matter. Doesn't make sense if you want to look at it from an environmental footprint standpoint. But at the same time, look at me. I want to get, more dense protein in my body, so I'll eat meat. Not every day, but on occasion. So yeah, I think, but we're starting to move in. I mean, more and more we're moving in that direction. I mean, it's veganism and vegetarian used to be kind of like a fringe thing back in, I don't know, 1990s and 2000s even. Now it's like being vegan is quite common, right? So, and then therefore the market is shifting in that way. So you go and you can get vegan anything in the store, right? Like I don't drink milk, and it's not a moral argument. I just don't like it. Like it doesn't taste good, and I don't like. Yeah, I just don't like. It doesn't give me a good feeling. I drink almond milk, and just because I like it, and it's it doesn't like the other milk alternative just doesn't work for me, and it's not hard to get almond milk or soy milk or anything like that. It's cost effective, like it's relatively affordable, and it's widely available, whereas it wasn't 10 years ago. So in for 322, I've heard it. Yeah, for sure. I've studied that. So soy particularly. Um, Soy. So there's a paper I'll post as teleconnections in the Earth system. It was like in 2006, I think. And what had happened, there was like, so a lot of soy is consumed in China, and there was a big spike for demand of soy in China in the mid 2000s, between 2000 and 2010. And that it tied it. They call it a teleconnection because you saw this demand spike in the economy for soy in China, and then at the same time you saw an increase in deforestation in Amazonia. Why? Because a lot of Brazilian farmers realized that there was a market for this and started hacking down rainforest and growing soy. You can see it. You can see it in the deforestation. But then that changed. I don't know if it was a demand change or there were some pretty severe policies put in place in Amazonia for forest conservation in the later 2000, like 27, 28, 2007, 8, 9, something like that. I worked in the Amazon from 2000 to 2006. Deforestation went down dramatically up into 2010. Part of it had to do with curbing back the soy production. So yeah, definitely. Soy caused a lot of deforestation. So one thing that we can start to consider then in the ecological imperative uh, section. Yeah, you have to look at this stuff like free range beef, for instance. I always like to look at it as a well to wheel analysis. You use well to wheel analysis for oil, from the wellhead to the wheel. Same thing should apply for everything. It's a life cycle assessment. If I'm going to eat soy, you should really understand where that comes from, how it's formulated, like how it's grown. Is it carbon intensive? Is that soy that is grown where there used to be a rainforest, for instance, and then sent across the world? So there's a large carbon footprint associated with the transportation. You look at that life cycle assessment of all these commodities. That's an important thing to do in order to really understand kind of what the real impacts of something are. So what I want you to think about then from this is the role of reason, the role of objectivity in how we're managing and understanding ecosystems, and then how we then may need to change that when we start to think about sustainable development and balancing different imperatives, economic and social imperatives, right? So what way of thinking do we need to use in order to do that? See, like a Francis Bacon would say, well, if you want to balance the ecological imperative and the economic imperative, you just say, let's go make some, let's do whatever we want in order to maximize our well-being as human beings, regardless of what the impacts on nature are going to be. That's a Baconian view, roughly, not exactly, but. So I want you to think about, like, just take into consideration some of the thinking that has gone on in the past from this, the Age of Reason, and how that translates into the things that we're dealing with today, right? And also try and pull some of these things back today, because we're going in some directions where it's like, okay, science is wrong. It's like, well, I don't know. Look at the world around us. We've constructed a lot of pretty impressive things based on reason and the scientific method and engineering and technology that resulted. Newton's laws. If you didn't have Newton's laws, there would be no buildings around us right now.
In the next 40.
Anybody have any questions? Did you learn something about where ecology came from today? Did anybody know about Linnaeus before tonight? So Linnaeus is, if you're thinking about, Linnaeus is the bomb when it comes to classification of biology, taxa. The Linnaean system was the first real Western system for systematically classifying things. One could say is almost the father of ecology in some ways. Bacon? Anybody here Francis Bacon? Probably not. Although he was a prolific and powerful thinker, for sure. You always got to look at the time at which someone is alive to kind of cast your judgments, because that's going to dictate how they. This is my business psychology course. Are you okay? And so Bacon, and then we talked about René Descartes, right? So I painted Descartes as to be a bad guy in this, but he's not really. It's just a very Cartesian worldview, right? All right. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.